Welcome everybody to today's discussion about the topic of transitions. I'm Steve Russell and I'm the Chief Governance Officer of the AMTIVO Group. A little bit about AMTIVO, we're a global conformity assessment body and we provide accredited certification for a wide range of international standards and across a broad spectrum of industries. We have over 36,000 live certificates across 27 countries and we have offices in Europe, North America and Asia. As a conformity assessment body, our raison d'etre is to audit organisations' management systems against such standards as ISO 9001, 14001 and 45001. And in our role as a collaborative certification partner, we've had hands-on involvement with many transitions, helping us develop a very clear understanding of what works well and also the potential pitfalls. Before I introduce you to my colleagues, I would like to think it'd be helpful just to clarify the cyclical revision of ISO standards is a normal structured process. It's not indicative of a problem. However, that said, it can carry a real commercial risk if not acted upon. Typically, in our experience, the organisations that come out ahead are the ones that treat transitions as something to plan around and not to react to. Currently, there are a number of significant transitions in the pipeline, and arguably the three most prominent examples are those which we're going to focus on today: ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and ISO 45001. And with that, I'll give my colleagues on the call the opportunity to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Kelly Thornton. I'm a Group QEHS Technical Manager. I've been with AMTIVO for just under 2 years now, and looking forward to the webinar.
Hi everyone, I'm Vicky Cleash. I am the Group InfoSec Technical Manager. I've been with AMTIVO now for about 6.5 years. And yeah, as Kelly said, excited to be here today.
Hi everyone, I am Jyoti and I work with AMTIVO as a Head of Channel Management. I have been AMTIVO around 9 months and I'm really excited to be a part of webinar.
So, I guess a good place to start would be by asking what triggers lead to ISO to revising a standard, and is this common across all standards? Vicky.
So I'm going to start by answering that with kind of a retrospective on a recent standard that's not long finished their transition, which is ISO 27001. So for anyone in our audience that's already been through that, I think this will help you understand what's maybe coming your way if you have 9, 14 and 45. And for anyone that hasn't been through that journey yet, it might give you a bit of an insight as to what to expect if you're thinking about sort of moving forward with those standards. I would hope that this kind of will give you a little bit of an idea of how best to start planning, because the key message in today's webinar from me will be that planning is key when it comes to these scenarios. So I'll start with helping the audience to understand what ISO's process is for revising a standard. Typically, standards will go through a 5-year systematic review cycle. What typically will happen is that a committee will be formed, a technical committee, and they will then look at a standard and they will decide on appropriate action. So they may decide to amend, revise, or even withdraw a standard. That can happen. I think it's important to remember that a review doesn't always lead to a change. No change could be a valid outcome from the technical committee's review of a standard. So to dive deep into that standard in a little bit more detail, first and foremost, the first step will be the systematic review. Once they've put together a draft, for example, that will be put out to a ballot or a vote by the committee members. And a working draft or a committee draft will be put together and agreed. Once everyone's kind of in alignment with that, something called a draft international standard, or DIS, as you might have heard before, will be put out for wider consultation. Following that, following feedback from different or input, from different areas, a final draft international standard, or FDIS, will be created, and it will go out once more for a final vote and final review. And then finally comes the most important part, which is the publication. And that's where the transition will start, or the transition clock, shall we say, will start. We'll touch upon that later on in the webinar. So just to kind of reiterate, 27001 followed that exact process. The 2013 version was revised to the 2022 version. The transition deadline, or clock, shall we say, started on the 31st of October 2022, and it finished on the 31st of October 2025. There were certain points that CBs had to hit, or timelines or goals that CBs had to hit, as well as clients. And then all new audits against the 2022 version started after 31st of October. There was actually then an amendment following that, which was really, really small. So in 2024, there was a very small amendment to clause 4.1 regarding climate change. That didn't require a full-blown transition. So the point I'm raising with that is that revisions can be very small. They could be targeted. They're not. It wasn't just a full rewrite at that point, even though the standard had not long been through a full rewrite, shall we say. And I think a question on everyone's brains typically is, why did it need updated? Why did ISMS need that transition? And I think the important message is that the kind of world is forever changing, as we know. For example, with information security, cybersecurity events are forever increasing. They're increasing in severity as well. So the need for solid and robust governance, shall we say, is forever increasing as well. New legislation is reshaping information security landscape, if you will. A key example is the UK Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. Not in practice just yet, but it's coming. And the inputs and the requirements of that are going to influence a standard, and thus there might need to be another revision coming. But it's the point I'm trying to make is that, as we said, the world is forever changing. So there's going to be triggers that will influence a technical committee or ISO to be proactive and react to those changing environments, shall we say.
Thanks, Vicky. Kelly, any additional thoughts on why standards get revised?
Well, picking up on what Vicky's just kind of walked us through, as she rightly pointed out, the standards don't get revised in a vacuum. They evolve because the environment they're written for keeps moving. The world a standard was drafted against 5 or 10 years ago isn't the world of certified organisations operating in today. So if we break down what's actually driving the changes, there's kind of three consistent threads. First, new and emerging risks, so things the original technical committee either didn't anticipate or didn't exist at the scale they do now. Secondly, shifts in international best practices. The way good is defined internationally does not stand still, and our standards need to keep pace with that consensus. And thirdly, real-world certification feedback. That third driver is particularly important because it comes from the coalface. Auditors are often the first people to spot where a standard's starting to creak a bit. They see it in ambiguous wording that different organisations interpret in different ways, controls that have quietly become outdated, and what is probably the clearest signal of all, organisations that are technically compliant on paper but aren't actually secure or safe or in control of their management system in practice. So that gap between compliant and genuinely effective is the kind of feedback that gets fed back through national bodies into the technical committees, and it's the direct input into why and when a standard gets revised. So when we talk about a revision landscape, it isn't change for the sake of it. It's the standards catching up with what auditors, certified organisations and the wider market are telling it.
Thanks, Kelly. And so, Jyoti, what does what revision actually signal?
And thanks, Steve, for asking this question. Actually, our revision doesn't mean the previous version was flawed. Actually, it signals the collective expectation of good practice moved on. What counted as adequate risk management, governance, or controls 5-10 years ago may not reflect good today. Revisions formally acknowledge that bar has shifted. They give certified organization a clear, structured route to move with it. Alternative would be organization interpreting change informally with no consistent benchmark. Yeah.
Thanks, Jyoti. Now, Vicky, we see a revision as something that's constructive and not corrective. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think to kind of elaborate on what Jyoti was just saying, revision should be framed as forward thinking. They're not corrective. Yes, in some scenarios they are corrective in some senses, that we've obviously that they're picking up that there are changes to like legislation, etc. But that we shouldn't associate a negative connotation to the word corrective or the term corrective as such. We are just forward thinking, we're forward planning, and we're innovation. We're being innovative with our management standards. It's not about penalising organisations for following the previous version. Again, it's about growth. It's about change. It's positive for me. The purpose is to keep the standard relevant, credible, and genuinely useful as a benchmark to our businesses. And revision is what keeps certification meaningful for our businesses and for customers who rely on that.
Thanks, Vicky. The next question I have is close to my heart because I'm Chief Governance Officer and it talks about accreditation bodies. So, Kelly, Amtivo prides itself on providing accredited certification under the auspices of the approvals that we hold from various national accreditation bodies, such as the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, the Irish National Accreditation Board, and the American National Accreditation Board. What role do these organisations play in the transition process?
So there's a number of things to this. I think there's a common assumption that once the standard's published, that certification bodies like Amtivo can start issuing accredited certificates straight away, and that's not quite how it works. So I'll talk a little bit about the sequence that stops people getting caught out on the timing, basically. The transition period officially starts the moment the revised standard's published. That's our trigger point. But certification bodies can't issue accredited certificates against that new version immediately. We have to transition our own systems first, and that's where the accreditation bodies come in. It starts with Global ACI. They're the international authority responsible for accredited certification bodies, and they issue a mandatory document setting out the framework for how the transition is to be managed globally. National accreditation bodies then take that framework and consolidate it into their own formalized transition approach, which every certification body they accredit follows. Once we, as a certification body, have been successful in achieving our transition and following that approach by our accreditation body, we can begin issuing accredited certificates against the updated standard. Realistically, that sequence from publication through the accreditation body's own process through to us being audited and cleared to issue certification, that can take somewhere in the region of 6 to 12 months. The important part here is this doesn't mean nothing can happen in that window. There's nothing stopping us from delivering transition audits from day one of publication. What we can't do is issue an accredited certificate until we've completed our transition. So for organisations, that doesn't mean, oh, our certification body hasn't transitioned yet, so there's nothing to do yet. The audit activity and the preparation behind it can and should start well before that 6 to 12 month accreditation process has run its course, and we will follow up accordingly with those organisations.
Thanks, Kelly, because that covered a lot of points that a lot of people are really not clear on at the top end of the accreditation process. So thank you. Jyoti, in your experience, what are leadership teams most commonly getting wrong in terms of transitions?
Yeah, Steve. And thanks, Kelly, for covering that part. So basically, here, not taking into consideration potential delays to their CB, ability to issue certificates against the new version of the standard caused by the process previously outlined by Kelly. waiting for the publication of the new standard itself rather than taking the opportunity to prepare changes in advance through consultation of the draft or final draft international standard. Internal preparation is very important. For example, gap analysis, documentation, or internal audit is regularly underestimated. It's a real operational change, not admin. Leaving it late creates avoidable pressure and risk of missing the window. It's very important. Sometimes we feel that, oh, we'll do it, but we should not. We should head in our game. Commercial pressure can often begin to be exerted by customer before regulatory deadlines are even reached.
That's very true, Jyoti, and I think that's an ideal segue into the second section of the webinar when we're going to look at what the current revision landscape means. Kelly, there's 3 standards are being revised within a relatively short time frame.
Yeah.
Why is this significant to certificated organisations?
So we've got several widely adopted standards that are transitioning around the same time. This means that management teams and leadership teams need to think across their management systems rather than treating each standard in isolation. Your preparation and your work to integrate those transitions becomes much more important. You also have to deal with the different timescales that you're working to, which means that planning now and planning early will help to protect your certification. It also gives organisations with an integrated management system a great opportunity. You can align your improvements across quality, environmental and health and safety all at the same time. And you can make better use of both your internal and your external audit activity. So it's not about panicking because there's lots to do at once. It's just about recognizing that that preparation is all the more important and is going to take maybe a little bit longer than you would normally expect for one standard.
And that's an excellent piece of advice. No need to panic.
Mm.
In terms of ISO 14001, which has already been published, what's the headline message for certified organisations?
So I think it's a pretty simple headline. The transition window started. So this isn't a future exercise anymore. It's live, it's here. But I do want to be careful with the framing based on what I've just gone through, because 3 years sounds really generous on paper, and that's kind of the trap that you really want to avoid as an organisation. It's not 3 years of usable implementation time. By the time you've factored in your gap analysis, your documentation updates, training, embedding the changes operationally, and then generating the evidence that your certification body is going to want to see, that runway is shrinking really quickly. So the starting point has to be that structured gap analysis, understanding exactly what's changed between the previous edition of the standard and the new one, and mapping that against your existing management system. From there, you can look at your training and awareness across the organisation. And this is a point that's very close to my heart. This can't sit with your QEHS manager on their own. This has to be the organisation working together to look at how those changes touch all your operational areas, or whether they even do touch those operational areas. What does this mean for your objectives, your risk register, your operational controls? And the real benefit of starting early is you can spread that workload naturally across your existing audit cycle, rather than everything being in that last couple of months before the deadline, and then everything is a panic.
Thanks, Kelly. So no need to panic, but an early start is always advantageous.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Jyoti, if organisations haven't started yet, are they already behind?
Not necessarily, but earlier they start, the more option they'll have. The organizations that struggle are often those that assume transition can be completed in few weeks. But preparation includes updating documentation, communicating changes, implementing them, and generating evidence. Leaving everything until the final year significantly compress those activities. And this is really true, yeah.
That's for sure. So what conversations are clients having about 14001?
Yeah, while dealing with like either day-to-day, I connect with the client. So what I'm hearing, customers generally understand that there has been a revision, but are often unclear about what action is required. Many initially sees it as an administrative exercise, and And for example, the role of the partner is helping organization understand that certification protect commercial relationship as much as compliance. And it's very important, like many business assumes that there is a grace period. And I think so we all think that we will get grace period. But as their auditor will help or sort it out near the deadline. But in reality, once transition period ends, the old certificate is no longer valid. There is no grace period.
Thanks, Josie. And the next question for Vicky is particularly relevant because unusually we have 3 core transitions, part of which are all running concurrently. So Vic, typically we see 9001, 14001 and 45001 as commonly integrated standards. Firstly, why do you feel this level of integration is important in the business? And how do you think this level of integration will impact on the transitions?
So I think firstly, leadership teams are increasingly expecting a joined up approach to governance. And there's several reasons for that I think we've kind of touched upon throughout the webinar so far. So organisations are looking at enterprise risk rather than isolated risk. Similarly, leadership behaviours support success across quality, infosec, environmental, health and safety. And going back to the points that we referenced at the beginning, good governance principles are becoming increasingly consistent and required. Again, because of that forever changing environment, legislative, whatever, there really is a need for strong governance, and having these integrated standards it can formulate your backbone, basically. We've obviously got to remember that the key business drivers, such as changes in legislative environments, etc., are always there, and that, as I mentioned, that they're influencing our need to update these standards. So typically integration will impact transitions, especially in the current case, given that as you mentioned, there's 3 going on at the moment, and that's not something to be feared. So I think sometimes, again, going back to my point earlier, we associate negative connotations with different terms. And in this case, we say the word impact and people think that that's a negative term. But to me, these changes and these transitions are positively impactful to our businesses. Overall impacts of a transition above, and I'm sure we will cover this in more detail later on. I know we've touched upon it at some stage. We've mentioned it a couple of times, but I think we'll cover that in a little bit more detail later on.
Okay, thanks, Vic. Now, the ISO 9001 publication, hopefully coming soon, hot on the heels of the 14001 publication. Kelly, what do we know so far about the 9001 revision?
So publications anticipated in September, and kind of breaking news lately is it looks like it was the 16th of September. But I think the key message is that organisations don't need to wait for that final published text. There's enough visibility already through the final draft international standard to start some meaningful work now. In practical terms, you can start looking at that FDIS rather than waiting for the final published version, which will give you an accurate picture of where the current management system will need to change. That's going to be different for every organisation. It's going to be individual to how your organisational context and interested parties are engaged with your management system. It's going to depend on your risks, your opportunities, your performance measures. Looking at all of that will let you identify in advance exactly what the ISO revision is going to mean to you. And then when publication day comes, it's a confirmation point and not the starting gun.
Thanks, Kelly. And why is the effective transition period shorter than it appears? We've already touched on this before, but it is relevant to encourage organisations to be early adopters.
Yeah, it does come back to what we talked about earlier, but it's absolutely worth restating that publication is not the same moment as transition audits become available. we can begin as a certification body delivering transition audits from very early in that window. All we can't do is issue an accredited certificate until we've been through our own accreditation. So audits available and accredited certificate available is two different milestones, and the gap between them is where we'll be doing our own due diligence before we can proceed. If you layer on top of that the organisation's own timeline, your gap analysis, your implementation, internal audit management review, the window starts shrinking. So for a multi-site organisation, for example, it becomes more complex again. Your updates need to be implemented consistently across every site, which means revised training, internal audits repeatably, location by location. And that added coordination is what makes sort of 12 to 18 months disappear much quicker than you might expect once you begin. So planning before publication, to go back to my earlier point, is what will pay dividends.
Thanks, Kelly. Food for thought. Jyoti, why do some organisations underestimate 9001 transitions?
Yeah, Steve, this is a very valid question. Actually, mostly people focus on updating procedure, but the bigger challenge is embedding changes into how the organization actually operates. Like, for example, internal communication, leadership engagement, and generating evidence all take time. Customers often underestimate how quickly transition windows passes. A well-managed transition sends a very strong signal of credibility when business can show a client or prospect that they are already ahead of a revision. It shows that business runs smoothly, not just on paper, but in practice as well. A transition that isn't planned well can end up costing more than expected. Not only in emergency consulting fees, like for those organizations who choose to employ external consultant, basically, but also in compressed timeline, like as I mentioned earlier, or Kelly was mentioning, Vicky was mentioning, like, internal process, gap analysis, documentation, all this thing is like, these are definitely, we are going to compress activities that the timeline are going to be compressed, and rushed audit and possible gap in certification status at exactly the time a client or procurement team is checking, because mostly clients are coming, they are on procurement, or they are on any bid is going on at the time. If they are submitting, and the certificate is very important, and if certificate has any gap, it can impact the commercial as well as compliance. Yeah.
Thanks, Jyoti. Well, Vicky, earlier in the webinar, you used an example of a previous transition that's been successfully completed, that for ISMS 27001. And so are quality, environmental and information security becoming more aligned? And how might the integration impact the transitions we're discussing if they're not yet fully integrated?
Good question. And I think I sound a bit like a broken record when I say this, but the overwhelming need at in this current climate to have robust management, governance, strong principles in place with business is of utmost importance. And I think with having these standards all in place, it's only going to strengthen your position in achieving that goal. So I mean, I think the question on everyone's tongues, if I have a 9 and a 14 that are about to go through a transition, but I've just transitioned to my 27, kind of where does that leave me? What does that look like for me? So I think if you do have an integrated management system where one of them is about to go through a transition and the other one isn't, I think firstly it's important not to overcomplicate things. Focus on the changes that are at hand. A robust and detailed gap analysis is going to be a beacon of light for you in this type of scenario. It's going to really show you where those changes are required, where your gaps are, etc. I think Jyoti quite rightly touched upon that earlier. And without getting too technical, most standards share what we refer to as a harmonized structure. And I think that's really, really important to remember, because whilst it doesn't make the standards the same, the flow of a standard and the requirements of a standard are typically aligned or similar in nature. So like I said, the gap analysis is going to really help you here. It will highlight to you very quickly where standard changes are likely to touch shared documents or processes. For me as well, other key factors to consider would be aware of your deadlines. I think Kelly, went over that in quite a lot of detail earlier on. Some of these standards might have differing timelines, so be aware of those. Keep an eye out on your CB's direction. Where's their transition policies, etc. If you have questions, don't be afraid to ask. They will know. And be methodical in your approach. So start with your overarching policy updates and work your way downwards if that's what suits your business at the time.
Thanks, Vic. Now, 14,001 has already been released. 9,001 will probably be released on the 16th of September. And 45,001 might seem a long way away, but it's not, is it, Kelly? So what should organisations be doing now?
So I'm going to join Vicky on the broken record and say don't wait for publication before thinking about transition. It's just as true here as it was earlier for 9 and for 14. The most useful thing an organisation could do right now is focus on demonstrating that their management system, the health and safety management system, is genuinely embedded and actually delivering results, not simply a paper exercise. The strong fundamentals today are what will make your future transition smooth rather than disruptive. So practically, that means keeping your management reviews, your internal audits, your risk assessments operating effectively and consistently, and following the progress of the revision as it moves through the ISO process. That way, when publication does arrive, there's no surprises in terms of the scope or direction.
Thanks. And I think, Kelly, everybody who's been listening so far will already know the answer we're going to give to this next question, but I will ask it anyway to allow you the opportunity to emphasise. So, should organisations wait?
No.
I agree.
If you've got a genuinely well-run management system, you'll be continually improving anyway. Whether a revision is on the horizon or not, organisation with mature systems will find transition easier, not because there's less demand on them from the standards, but because they're already reviewing their performance, they're already closing out their actions, they're already evidencing effectiveness. So transition is more of an adjustment than a project. So no, don't wait.
Thanks, Kelly. No surprises there. And what are you hearing from organisations in this respect, Jyoti?
Yeah, and as Kelly mentioned, and as Steve, you and Vicky as well. So basically, mostly what I'm hearing, we have got plenty of time, right? And we will deal it with when standard is published. As Vicky and Kelly clearly mentioned that, hey, start your preparation, do not wait. So basically what is happening that people are thinking, hey, we can deal it with when the standard is published. And mostly people are also thinking, surely it is just updating some documents. But in reality, internal preparation usually takes much longer than expected. Transition affects people, process, and evidence, not just only documentation. Also, very important, leadership involvement is essential. When leaders engage early, transition run noticeably smoother. The real advantage comes from timeline, planning, getting ahead of every stage, not just the deadline, not waiting for the deadline. So these are these steps. If we can follow, we can definitely win at the end.
Very good and very clear steps. Thank you, Jyoti.
Yeah.
So, Vicky, in your opinion, what do leadership teams underestimate?
So for me, there's kind of 4 main aspects that I feel are usually quite underestimated. The first being the amount of coordination that's required across functions in order to fully embed the required changes. I think, again, we've touched upon that. Secondly, the importance of assigning ownership early. Early planning and early communication is key. So everyone kind of knows where they stand. Everyone knows what's required. Planning again. The time needed to demonstrate implementation rather than simply making the changes. And finally, the commercial consequence of delayed transition. Going back to Jyoti's point earlier and Kelly's point and your point even, whilst taking your time, planning adequately, etc., are paramount, it's not something that you can just wait and leave to the last minute. You need to be proactive. instead of reactive, which is a term that I think we mentioned right at the very beginning.
One could say that perfect preparation prevents poor performance.
Exactly that, Steve.
And moving on to a closing question, what's the single most important thing that a leadership team could do in the next 90 days to protect their certification status?
So for me, it would be assigning ownership. Every successful transition has someone accountable for driving it. In the next 90 days, if you identify who owns your transition, carry out your gap analysis and build a realistic implementation plan, then you're not going to find yourself under pressure later.
Thank you, Kelly. Vicky?
So I think for me, we should be treating standard revisions as a governance project rather than a compliance issue. Leadership teams should make transitions a standing agenda item. We should be already understanding the business risks and ensure that they're receiving regular progress updates and communicating these to the rest of our business. As I mentioned, going back to me being a broken record, for me, strong governance leads to smoother transitions.
And Jyoti, final comment from yourself?
Yeah, so very important, have the conversation now. Speak to a certification body like MTO and understand the transition timeline. Do not assume that you will have 3 full years to prepare. The earlier you engage, the more option you will have to build transition naturally into your audit program instead of rushing at the end. Yeah, that's what I feel.
Well, thanks, Jyoti. Thanks, Kelly. And thanks, Vicky. Thanks to all your insights. And I hope that everyone found that useful. If there's one message to leave everyone with today, it's that standards revisions are a normal part of the certification life cycle. But successful organizations don't simply react when deadline approaches. They plan, they prepare, and they see a transition as an opportunity to strengthen their business. Those who start now will not only protect their certification, but the confidence of their customers and stakeholders. So to conclude, if you're seeking further information, then please visit the AMTIVO website, look at the transition support pages, or use the contact form to get in touch, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.